Everyone laughed when Black Janitor sat down at the piano, but the moment he played the first note, the crystal chandeliers of Brookshire Conservatory cast warm light across the marble floors as the evening's showcase wound down. Students in their finest attire clustered around the grand Steinway piano, their voices carrying the satisfied exhaustion that comes after months of preparation. The air still hummed with the echoes of Chopin and Rachmaninoff, performed by some of the most promising young musicians on the East Coast. Samuel Washington moved quietly through the crowd, his gray janitor's uniform making him nearly invisible among the designer dresses and tailored suits. At 62, he had perfected the art of being unseen, a skill that served him well in places like this, where his presence was tolerated but rarely acknowledged. His weathered hands gripped the handle of his cleaning cart as he navigated between clusters of wealthy donors and prideful parents. "Did you hear Madison's interpretation of the Moonlight Sonata?" a woman in pearls whispered to her companion. "Simply divine. Harvard's music program would be lucky to have her." Samuel had heard Madison play. She was technically proficient, but her performance lacked soul, all precision, no passion. He'd learned long ago to keep such observations to himself. Near the piano, a group of 5 students had gathered around Preston Carruthers III, whose family name graced one of the building's wings. Preston's blonde hair was perfectly styled, and his navy blazer bore the subtle embroidery of an exclusive prep school. Everything about him screamed privilege and entitlement. "I swear, if I have to sit through one more evening of amateur hour," Preston drawled, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Half these kids wouldn't know real music if it slapped them in the face." His companions, Brittany, Chase, Madison, and Tyler, laughed dutifully. They formed the conservatory's unofficial royal court, united by trust funds and last names that opened doors before they even knocked. Samuel pushed his cart closer to the piano area, where scattered sheet music lay forgotten on chairs and music stands. The students had been careless, as usual, leaving their expensive sheet music scattered like confetti. He began collecting the pages, careful not to crease them. Each sheet represented hours of practice, dreams of grandeur, futures carved in major and minor keys. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice. Samuel looked up to see Brittany Sterling, her arms crossed and lips pursed in annoyance. "Could you maybe clean somewhere else? We're trying to have a conversation here." "Sorry, miss," Samuel replied quietly, continuing to gather the scattered music. "Just cleaning up the area." Preston turned, noticing Samuel for the first time. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well. Looks like we have an audience." His voice carried just enough volume to draw attention from nearby groups. Samuel kept his head down, stacking the sheet music with practiced efficiency. He'd dealt with kids like Preston before, entitled, bored, looking for entertainment at someone else's expense. "Hey, janitor man," Preston called out, causing several conversations to pause. "You know what this is?" He gestured grandly at the sheet music in Samuel's hands. "Sheet music," Samuel answered simply, not looking up. "Oh, he can read!" Preston exclaimed mockingly. "Ladies and gentlemen, our janitor is literate!" His friends erupted in laughter, and Samuel felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up his neck. Madison leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Do you actually know how to read music, or do you just know what the papers are called?" Samuel straightened, meeting her gaze for just a moment. Something flickered in his eyes, a depth that made her instinctively step back. But the moment passed, and he returned to his task. "Come on, guys, leave him alone," said a voice from the edge of the group. Emily Chen, a junior from California, pushed through the circle. Her black hair was simply styled, and she wore a modest blue dress that stood out among the designer gowns for its very ordinariness. "He's just doing his job." "Oh, Emily," Brittany sighed dramatically. "Always the bleeding heart. We're just having a little fun." "At his expense," Emily shot back, moving to help Samuel collect the remaining sheets. Preston's eyes lit up with malicious inspiration. He strode to the piano bench and patted it theatrically. "You know what? I have an idea." Since our janitor friend here is so interested in sheet music, why don't we give him a real education? He snatched a piece of music from Samuel's stack, Beethoven's Pathetic Sonata, and placed it on the piano's music stand with exaggerated ceremony. There you go, maestro, Preston announced loudly, drawing even more attention from across the room. Show us what you've got. I'm sure everyone would love to hear the janitor's interpretation of Beethoven. The Gavin crowd began to murmur and chuckle. Someone pulled out a phone to record what promised to be an amusing spectacle. Samuel stood frozen, the remaining sheet music clutched in his hands. Preston, that's enough, Emily said firmly, but her voice was lost in the growing laughter. What's wrong? Preston taunted. Afraid you might actually have to back up all that musical knowledge you've been absorbing while mopping our floors? Samuel looked at the piano, the instrument that had once been his entire world. His fingers, hidden beneath yellow cleaning gloves, unconsciously flexed. The muscle memory was still there, waiting beneath years of suppression. I should get back to work, he said quietly, turning away. But Preston wasn't finished. He moved quickly, blocking Samuel's path. Oh no, you don't get to walk away now. You've been listening to us play for months. Surely you've picked up something? His voice rose to ensure maximum audience participation. Unless, of course, you're just a help and know your place. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. For just a moment, his carefully constructed walls cracked, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Emily saw it first, the subtle change in his posture, the way his breathing shifted. Samuel, she said softly, using his name for the first time. You don't have to do this. But Samuel was already moving toward the piano bench. The room fell silent as he sat down, his back straight despite the years of bending over mop buckets and vacuum cleaners. He pulled off his cleaning gloves, revealing hands that were callous but elegant, with long fingers that seemed to know exactly where they belong. Preston smirked triumphantly. This should be good, he whispered to his friends. Samuel placed his fingers on the keys, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, without looking at the sheet music, he began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the room like liquid gold, each phrase more impossible than the last. This wasn't the Beethoven that Preston had mockingly suggested. This was something infinitely more complex, more beautiful, more soul-shattering. Samuel's fingers danced across the keys with a fluidity that defied belief. His whole body moved with the music, decades of muscle memory awakening from its long sleep. The notes poured from the piano like a river breaking through a dam, carrying with them years of suppressed emotion, lost dreams, and unspoken pain. The room was dead silent except for the music. Jaws literally dropped. Phones that had been raised to capture a humiliating moment now recorded something extraordinary. Preston's smirk vanished, replaced by shock and something that might have been fear. Emily stood transfixed, tears forming in her eyes as she realized she was witnessing something sacred, the awakening of a master who had been hiding in plain sight. Samuel played for nearly 10 minutes, pouring his entire being into the music. When the last note faded into the stunned silence, he sat motionless for a moment, as if returning from a distant place. Then, without a word, he stood, pulled his gloves back on, and quietly left the room. The silence stretched for another full minute before the whispers began. Emily Chen's hands trembled as she stared at her phone screen, the recording still playing in a loop. She had started filming the moment Samuel sat down at the piano, initially thinking she might need evidence if things got ugly. What she captured instead was pure magic, 10 minutes and 37 seconds that would change everything. Around her, the conservatory's grand hall buzzed with frantic whispers. Students clustered in tight groups, their voices mixing disbelief with excitement. Did that really just happen? Who is that guy? How does a janitor play like that? Preston stood frozen by the piano, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. The smug confidence that had defined him moments earlier had evaporated completely. His friends huddled around him, equally stunned, their carefully constructed world of privilege suddenly feeling very small. Preston, Brittany whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. People are staring. Indeed they were. Dozens of phones had captured the performance from different angles, and Preston's cruel setup had been recorded along with Samuel's breathtaking response. The golden boy of Brookshire Conservatory had just been publicly humbled by the man he tried to humiliate. Emily looked around for Samuel, but he had vanished as quietly as he'd appeared. She pocketed her phone and pushed through the crowd, heading for the service corridors where she'd seen him disappear. The contrast between the marble elegance of the main hall and the utilitarian gray walls of the back passages felt stark and telling. She found him in a small supply closet, methodically organizing cleaning supplies with shaking hands. His gray uniform seemed to hang heavier on his shoulders now, as if the weight of exposure was physically crushing him. "Samuel," she said softly from the doorway. He didn't look up, but his hand stilled on a bottle of floor cleaner. "You shouldn't be back here, miss. Students aren't allowed in the service areas." Emily struggled for words. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Samuel finally turned, and Emily was struck by the depth of pain in his dark eyes. This wasn't just a janitor who happened to play piano. This was someone carrying the weight of a story much larger than anyone had imagined. "It was a mistake," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have done that. Are you kidding me?" Emily stepped closer, her voice filled with genuine awe. "Do you have any idea how incredible you are? I've been studying here for 3 years, and I've never heard anything like that. Not from students, not from professors, not from visiting artists." That was showing off," Samuel interrupted, turning back to his supplies. "And showing off never leads anywhere good for people like me." Emily felt her heart break a little at the resignation in his voice. "People like you? You mean incredibly talented people? Because that's what I saw out there." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Emily thought he might not respond. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said, "I used to play. A long time ago." Before Emily could respond, her phone buzzed with notifications. Then it buzzed again. And again. She pulled it out, frowning at the screen. "What the?" Her eyes widened as she scrolled through message after message. "Samuel, I need to show you something. I really should get back to work," he said, but Emily was already pulling up her social media account. "I posted the video," she said quickly, seeing his expression. "I'm sorry, I should have asked, but I thought maybe just a few of my friends would see it. I wanted people to know how wrong they were about you." Samuel's face went pale. "You posted it where?" Emily's voice got smaller as she read the numbers. "TikTok, Instagram, Twitter." "Oh my God! Samuel, this has been shared over 1,000 times in the last 20 minutes. As if summoned by her words, Emily's phone rang. The caller ID showed her roommate's name. "Emma, I can't talk right now. Are you kidding me right now?" Emma's voice was so loud that Samuel could hear every word. "The video you posted is literally everywhere. It's on the front page of Reddit, it's been shared by the New York Times music critic, and Classical FM just posted it on their main page." Emily stared at Samuel in horror and amazement. "Emma, how many views? Last I checked? 2.8 million and climbing. Girl, you just broke the internet." The phone slipped from Emily's suddenly numb fingers. Samuel caught it before it hit the floor, his reflexes still sharp despite his age. 2.8 million, Emily whispered. Samuel handed back her phone with steady hands, but Emily could see the storm building behind his eyes. "I need you to take it down," he said quietly. "Samuel, Please," the word came out like a prayer. "I can't. This can't happen. Not again." "Again?" Emily caught the slip immediately. "What do you mean, again?" But Samuel was already walking away, his shoulders set in a rigid line that spoke of years of practice at running from things too big to face. Emily remained in the supply closet, her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. Comments were pouring in from around the world. "Who is this man? This is what happens when genius meets opportunity. Someone needs to find this janitor and get him a record deal." I'm literally crying. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. The hashtag janitor pianist was already trending. News outlets were picking up the story. Classical music blogs were analyzing the performance frame by frame. And somewhere in the service corridors of Brookshire Conservatory, Samuel Washington was discovering that some performances are too powerful to take back, no matter how desperately you might want to disappear. By morning, the world would be looking for him. Dean Margaret Hayes arrived at Brookshire Conservatory at 6:47 a.m., clutching her third cup of coffee and dreading another day of juggling financial crises. At 55, she'd spent the last 3 years watching the prestigious institution slowly bleed money. Enrollment was down, donations had dried up, and the board of trustees was breathing down her neck with threats of closure. She pushed through the heavy oak doors of her office, already mentally preparing for her morning ritual of reviewing unpaid bills and rejected grant applications. But today, her assistant Janet was waiting with an expression that fell somewhere between panic and elation. "Dean Hayes," Janet said, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "You need to see this. Now." "Janet, whatever crisis we're dealing with today, I need coffee first and—" "It's Samuel," Janet interrupted, holding up her tablet. "Samuel Washington. Our night janitor." Margaret paused, coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What about him? Did something happen? Is he hurt?" "He's famous," Janet said, turning the screen toward her boss. "He's internet famous. Look." Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and stared at the screen. The video was paused on Samuel's face as he sat at the conservatory's grand piano, his expression serene and focused. The view count at the bottom made her do a double take. 12 million views, she whispered. "And climbing," Janet added. "Dean, this video was posted less than 12 hours ago." The Today Show called. So did CNN. And Good Morning America. And she consulted her notes, frantically. 60 Minutes, NPR, the BBC, and something called The Piano Guys. Margaret hit play and watched in stunned silence as Samuel's fingers transformed their struggling institution's piano into something magical. She'd walked past this man hundreds of times, exchanged polite nods, signed his paychecks, and never once imagined. "My God!" she breathed. "How did we not know?" Down the hall, in the conservatory's main office, Carla Prescott was having a very different morning. The development director had built her career on careful networking, strategic flattery, and an uncanny ability to align herself with success while distancing herself from failure. At 42, she was perfectly coiffed, immaculately dressed, and absolutely terrified. Because she was very clearly visible in several versions of the viral video, laughing loudly at Samuel's expense. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since 5 a.m. Friends, colleagues, and worst of all, donors, were calling to ask about that horrible woman who'd mocked the janitor before his breathtaking performance. Social media had been particularly unkind, with several threads dedicated to identifying and shaming the cruel staff member who'd participated in Samuel's humiliation. Carla's carefully constructed professional image was crumbling in real time. "This is a disaster," she muttered, pacing her office while frantically typing responses on her laptop. She'd already drafted 3 different Facebook posts claiming the video was fake, edited, or somehow staged. Each one sounded more desperate than the last. Her office door burst open without a knock. Preston Carruthers III stood in the doorway, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his prep school composure completely shattered. "Miss Prescott," he said urgently, "we need to talk." "Preston, you can't just—" "They're calling me the villain," he interrupted, holding up his phone. "There are memes of my face with entitled brat written underneath. My father is furious. The family's lawyers are asking if we can sue for defamation, but apparently truth is a defense against that." Carla looked at the young man who'd been one of her favorite students, wealthy, connected, and usually grateful for the special treatment his family's donations bought him. Now he looked like what he'd always been, a spoiled child who'd finally faced consequences. "We need to control this narrative," Carla said, her mind racing. If we can prove the video is fake somehow, or that this whole thing was staged. But it wasn't fake, Preston said miserably. I was there. We all saw him play. It was real, and it was incredible, and His voice cracked. I was horrible to him. Back in the dean's office, Margaret was fielding calls from reporters while Janet tried to manage the flood of interview requests. The conservatory's website had crashed from traffic, their social media accounts were gaining thousands of followers by the hour, and the development office reported that they'd received more donation inquiries in the past 6 hours than in the previous 6 months. Dean Hayes, came a voice from the doorway. Margaret looked up to see Dr. James Morrison, the conservatory's head of piano studies and one of their most respected faculty members. His usually stern expression was replaced by something she'd rarely seen, genuine excitement. James, have you seen? I've seen it, he said, settling into a chair across from her desk. I've watched it 17 times, actually. Margaret, that performance was extraordinary. Not just technically, though his technique is flawless, but emotionally. That man doesn't just play piano. He becomes the music. Margaret leaned back in her chair, suddenly seeing opportunity where she'd initially seen crisis. James, if we could get him to perform again, the publicity alone would be invaluable. He agreed. But there's something else. I recognize his playing style. The way he phrases certain passages, his interpretation of the emotional dynamics. Margaret, I think I know who he is. Before Margaret could respond, Janet burst through the door again. Dean Hayes, there's a problem. Samuel Washington didn't come to work last night. His supervisor says he's never missed a shift in 7 years, but he didn't show up and he's not answering his phone. Margaret felt her heart sink. After years of financial struggles, the universe had dropped a miracle into their laps, and he'd vanished. Find him, she said firmly. I don't care what it takes. Find Samuel Washington. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Samuel sat in darkness with his phone turned off, staring at the piano that had been gathering dust in his living room for 23 years. The past was catching up to him whether he wanted it to or not. And somewhere in the conservatory's gleaming halls, Carla Prescott was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. Dean Hayes found Samuel in practice room C at 3:17 a.m. on Thursday morning. After 2 days of searching, she'd finally thought to check the conservatory's security footage from previous weeks. The cameras had captured Samuel slipping into the small practice rooms after his shifts, always careful to lock the door behind him. She stood outside the soundproof door for a moment, listening to the muffled melody flowing from within. Even through the walls, she could hear the ache in the music, Chopin's Ballade No. 1, played with a depth of emotion that made her chest tight. Margaret knocked gently. The music stopped abruptly. Samuel? She called softly. It's Dean Hayes. May I come in? Silence stretched for nearly a full minute before she heard the click of the lock. Samuel opened the door just wide enough for her to enter, his eyes avoiding hers completely. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. The small practice room felt intimate and sacred. Sheet music was scattered across the upright piano's bench, pieces Margaret recognized as some of the most challenging works in the classical repertoire. Bach's Goldberg Variations, Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, Liszt's Transcendental Etudes. You've been coming here, she said, settling into the room's single chair. For how long? 7 years, Samuel answered quietly, still standing by the piano. Since I started working here. I hope it's okay. I always made sure everything was perfect when I left. Samuel, you could have asked. You could have used any of our pianos anytime you wanted. He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was staggering. People like me don't ask for things like that, Dean Hayes. Margaret felt something break inside her chest. People like what? Incredibly talented musicians? Samuel's laugh was hollow. Janitors. Black janitors who know their place. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret had spent her entire career in academia, surrounded by progressive ideals and diversity initiatives, but she was suddenly, brutally aware of how completely she'd failed this man. I need you to play for our donors, she said, then immediately regretted her directness. I'm sorry, that came out wrong. What I mean is, this video has created an opportunity. We could. No, Samuel's voice was firm. I can't do that again. Samuel, you don't understand. We're in serious financial trouble. This kind of publicity could save the conservatory. We could start a scholarship program, bring in students who... I said no. He turned to face her fully, and something in his posture had shifted. For the first time since she'd known him, Samuel Washington looked like a man who commanded stages, not one who mopped them. You want to know why I won't do it? You want to know why I'm hiding in practice rooms at 3 in the morning instead of calling back the Today Show? Margaret nodded, sensing she was about to hear something that would change everything. Samuel sat heavily on the piano bench, his hands finding the keys as if seeking comfort. My name used to be different. Professionally, anyway. I was Samuel Williamson. He played a soft, melancholy phrase. Maybe you've heard of me. Margaret's breath caught. Samuel Williamson. The name hit her like a physical blow. The Samuel Williamson? The prodigy who... She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth as the pieces fell into place. Who disappeared after the accident? Samuel's fingers moved across the keys, playing what Margaret now recognized as a funeral dirge. 23 years ago. My wife Maria and my daughter Isabella were coming to my concert at Carnegie Hall. It was supposed to be my breakthrough performance, my debut with the New York Philharmonic. Margaret felt tears forming as she realized where this story was heading. Drunk driver ran a red light. Samuel's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly on the keys. They died instantly. I was on stage taking my bow, and they were already gone. The practice room fell into profound silence. I couldn't play after that. Samuel continued. Every note reminded me of what I'd lost, what my ambition had cost them. They died rushing to see me succeed, and for what? So I could take a bow? So strangers could clap? Margaret wiped her eyes, beginning to understand the magnitude of what Samuel had lost, and what the world had lost when he disappeared. I changed my name, moved here, took the first job I could find that had nothing to do with music. I thought I could leave it behind. He gestured around the small practice room. But you can't leave music behind when it's part of your soul. So I came here at night, just to remember who I used to be. Samuel. Margaret whispered. Do you have any idea how many people have been looking for you? Music students wrote dissertations about your disappearance. There are conspiracy theories, tribute concerts. I know. He pulled his hands away from the keys as if they'd burned him. After the video went viral, I looked. There are websites dedicated to the mystery of Samuel Williamson. People who think I'm dead, people who think I had a breakdown, people who think I was never real to begin with. At that moment, they heard voices in the hallway outside. Margaret recognized one of them immediately, Emily Chen, speaking urgently to someone. She's in practice room C. I saw her go in there. Look, I know Samuel doesn't want attention, but hiding isn't going to make this go away. The whole world is looking for him now. The door opened, and Emily stepped inside, stopping short when she saw Samuel at the piano. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to intrude. She looked between Samuel and the dean. I've been trying to find you for days. I needed to apologize. This is all my fault. Samuel studied the young woman who'd inadvertently exposed his secret to the world. You were just trying to stand up for me. But I destroyed your privacy. Emily said, stepping closer. I've been reading about you, about Samuel Williamson. I know what happened to your family. I'm so sorry. You didn't know. Samuel said gently. Emily took a deep breath. The conservatory wants you to perform at the fundraising gala next week. And I know you don't want to, but... She paused, seeming to gather courage. What if you didn't do it for them? What if you did it for people like me? Samuel frowned. What do you mean? Kids who can't afford places like this. Kids whose parents work 2 jobs just to pay for lessons. Kids who get told they're not good enough because they don't have the right connections, or the right last names. Emily's voice grew stronger. Your music could change their lives. It could open doors that people like Preston think belong only to them. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the piano keys. They died going to see me perform, he said finally. Maybe it's time I honored that. The announcement came 3 days later at the weekly staff meeting. Dean Hayes stood before the assembled faculty and administrative staff, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness that everyone could feel. I'm pleased to announce that Samuel Washington, who many of you now know as our remarkably talented night janitor, has agreed to headline our annual fundraising gala this Saturday evening. Murmurs of approval rippled through the conference room. Dr. Morrison smiled broadly, and several faculty members exchanged excited whispers. But in the back corner, Carla Prescott felt her world tilt dangerously. She'd spent the last week watching her reputation crumble in real time. The donor calls had been brutal. 3 major benefactors had specifically mentioned her behavior in the viral video, with the Morrison Foundation, a $500,000 annual contributor, suggesting they might need to reassess their relationship with institutions that tolerate such attitudes toward working people. Now Samuel was being positioned as the savior of the very institution where she mocked him publicly. The irony was so bitter she could taste it. After the meeting, Carla cornered Dean Hayes in the hallway. Margaret, we need to talk about this decision. What about it? Dean Hayes was already walking briskly toward her office, arms full of gala preparations. We're putting all our eggs in one basket, Carla said, matching her pace. What if he chokes? What if he has a breakdown on stage? We're talking about our most important fundraising event of the year. Dean Hayes stopped and turned, studying Carla's face with new understanding. Are you concerned about the conservatory's reputation or your own? The question hit like a slap. I resent the implication. Carla, I've seen the donor feedback. I know what this week has been like for you. But Samuel's performance could save this institution. We've already received preliminary commitments for over $2 million, just based on the announcement that he'll be playing. $2 million. The number made Carla's stomach churn. If Samuel succeeded, if he became the face of Brookshire's revival, her own position would become increasingly precarious. Board members were already questioning her judgment, and a triumphant Samuel would be a constant reminder of her failure. That evening, Carla sat in her pristine home office, surrounded by donor files and fundraising reports, formulating a plan she knew was desperate and dangerous. But desperation had a way of making dangerous plans feel reasonable. She started with the sheet music. Samuel had requested specific pieces for the gala, a program that would showcase both technical brilliance and emotional depth. Carla had legitimate access to the music library, and it would be simple enough to make small changes. A wrong note here, an altered timing marking there. Nothing obvious enough to seem intentional, but enough to throw off even the most experienced pianist. Then came the Whisper campaign. Carla had spent 15 years cultivating relationships with Brookshire's wealthiest donors, and she knew exactly which strings to pull. She began making carefully worded phone calls, expressing concerns about the conservatory's direction. I'm just worried we're being hasty, she told Mrs. Rothschild, whose family had funded the conservatory's East Wing. This man disappeared from the music world for over 20 years. There might be reasons for that we don't know about. Mental health issues, perhaps? Substance abuse? Are we sure we want to tie our reputation to someone so unstable? With Mr. Chin, no relation to Emily, she took a different approach. I've heard rumors about his past performances. Some people are saying his technique was always more flash than substance. What if Saturday night exposes that? What if we've built him up based on one viral moment, and he can't deliver when it matters? Each call was poisonous, designed to plant seeds of doubt without making any claim she could be held accountable for later. But Carla's most dangerous move came on Friday afternoon. She'd learned that Samuel had been practicing in the main concert hall each evening, working with Dr. Morrison to prepare for Saturday's performance. The Hall's Steinway Concert Grand was a temperamental instrument that required precise tuning and careful maintenance. Carla waited until the building was nearly empty before making her way to the concert hall. The piano sat on the empty stage like a sleeping giant, its black surface reflecting the overhead lights. She opened the lid and stared at the strings inside, her hands trembling with the magnitude of what she was about to do. She didn't need to break anything, that would be too obvious. But she knew enough about pianos from years of fundraising events to understand their vulnerabilities. A few loosened tuning pins would cause the instrument to slip out of tune during performance, creating increasingly discordant sounds as Samuel played. By the time anyone realized what was happening, his performance would be ruined, and with it, his credibility. As she worked in the semi-darkness, Carla told herself she was protecting the conservatory from a risk they couldn't afford to take. But deep down, she knew the truth: she was protecting herself from the consequences of her own cruelty. 20 minutes later, she slipped out of the concert hall, leaving behind a piano that would betray Samuel at the worst possible moment. The next morning, Emily Chin was in the main office early, helping coordinate media arrangements for the gala, when she overheard a troubling phone conversation. Carla was in her office with the door ajar, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the phone. "I'm not saying don't come," Carla was saying. "I'm just suggesting you might want to temper your expectations. There's a reason this man has been hiding for 23 years, and it might not be just grief." Emily felt her blood run cold. She moved closer to the door, pretending to organize papers while straining to hear. "Between you and me, Margaret is desperate," Carla continued. "She's so focused on the financial potential that she's not thinking clearly about the risks. But you and I both know what happens when institutions make decisions based on viral internet fame instead of substance." Emily had heard enough. She pulled out her phone and began recording, her hands shaking with anger and determination. Whatever Carla was planning, Emily wasn't going to let her destroy Samuel's comeback before it even began. But as she crept away from Carla's office, Emily had no idea that the real sabotage had already been set in motion, waiting silently on the concert hall stage for tomorrow night. The Brookshire Conservatory's grand hall had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in midnight blue silk, while hundreds of white roses created an elegant backdrop for the evening's main event. The city's cultural elite filled every seat: philanthropists, music critics, socialites, and arts patrons who had paid $500 a plate just for the chance to witness Samuel's return. Photographers from the New York Times, Washington Post, and Classical Music magazine positioned themselves strategically around the hall. Camera crews from 3 major networks had set up discreet equipment to broadcast portions of the evening live. The hashtag Samuel Returns was already trending worldwide. In the green room behind the stage, Samuel sat alone in his borrowed tuxedo, staring at his hands. At 62, they showed the wear of 7 years of janitorial work: small scars, calloused palms, fingernails that were clean but would never quite lose the memory of cleaning supplies. Yet they were still a pianist's hands, still capable of magic. Emily knocked softly on the door. "Samuel? It's almost time." He looked up as she entered, seeing her own nervousness reflected in her formal black dress and carefully styled hair. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "The last time I performed for an audience like this was 23 years ago, and it ended in tragedy," Emily finished gently. "But tonight isn't about the past. It's about the future, for you, for the conservatory, and for all those kids who need to see that dreams don't have expiration dates." Samuel nodded, but Emily could see the doubt in his eyes. She was about to say more when Dean Hayes appeared in the doorway, radiant in an emerald evening gown but clearly stressed. "Samuel, we're ready for you," she said. "The audience is incredible. I've never seen such anticipation for a conservatory event. There are people here tonight who could change everything for this institution." As they walked toward the stage, Emily pulled out her phone and showed Samuel the messages flooding in from around the world. "Look at this," she said. "People from every continent are watching the live stream. Music students in Japan, elderly pianists in Germany, kids in school music programs across America. They're all here with you tonight. The weight of global attention should have been crushing, but instead Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: purpose. He wasn't just performing for the wealthy donors in the audience. He was performing for everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told they didn't belong. In the audience, Carla sat at table 12 with the Morrison Foundation board members, her stomach churning with anticipation and dread. She'd arrived early to ensure the piano hadn't been retuned, and her tampering remained undetected. As the lights dimmed, she found herself simultaneously hoping for and dreading what was about to unfold. Dean Hayes took the stage to thunderous applause. Ladies and gentlemen, 23 years ago, the music world lost one of its most promising talents. Tonight, Samuel Williamson returns. The applause was deafening as Samuel walked onto the stage, but he barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on the concert grand piano that had been his nemesis and salvation for more than 4 decades. He sat at the bench, adjusted the height slightly, and placed his hands on the keys for a moment of silent preparation. The hall fell into complete silence. Samuel had chosen to open with Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the piece that had launched his original career and the same one Dean Hayes had heard him playing in the practice room. It began quietly, almost tentatively, a single melodic line that seemed to whisper rather than sing. But something was wrong. The first few measures sounded perfect, but as Samuel moved into more complex passages, certain notes began to sound flat, creating subtle but increasingly noticeable dissonance. He frowned slightly, adjusting his touch, but the problem persisted. Years of experience told him exactly what was happening. The piano was slipping out of tune in real time. In the audience, Emily noticed his barely perceptible hesitation. Something was wrong, but she couldn't identify what. The music still sounded beautiful to her untrained ear, but she could see tension creeping into Samuel's shoulders. Carla watched with growing satisfaction as Samuel's performance became increasingly compromised. A few audience members were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing something amiss without understanding what. The live stream comments were starting to reflect confusion and disappointment. But Samuel Washington had not survived 23 years of hiding, loss, and redemption to be defeated by a sabotaged piano. As he reached the climactic section of the ballade, he made a decision that would be talked about in music circles for years to come. He abandoned the written music entirely. Instead of fighting the piano's deteriorating tuning, Samuel began to improvise, weaving Chopin's original themes through his own musical language, creating something entirely new. He turned the instrument's flaws into features, using the slightly flat notes as jazz-like blue notes that added unexpected emotional depth to the classical framework. The audience leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a performance, it was musical problem-solving at the highest level, creativity triumphing over sabotage in real time. Emily felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Samuel transform disaster into transcendence. This was why she had posted that first video, not for the perfection of his technique, but for the soul that poured through everything he touched. As the improvised conclusion built to its climax, Samuel's hands flew across the keys with renewed confidence. The flawed instrument sang under his touch, proving that true artistry could overcome any obstacle. But just as he approached the final phrase, the weight of memory crashed over him. The last time he had played for stakes this high, his wife and daughter had died rushing to hear him. The guilt that had driven him into hiding for 2 decades suddenly felt overwhelming. His hands froze on the keys, the music hanging incomplete in the stunned silence of the hall. Emily saw the moment when past and present collided in Samuel's mind. Without thinking, she stood up from her seat in the front row and began to clap, slowly, deliberately, building a rhythm that seemed to call him back to the present. "They're listening," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustic perfection of the hall. "They laughed before. Tonight they're listening." Her words broke through Samuel's paralysis. He looked out at the audience, not at the wealthy donors or intimidating critics, but at Emily's face, shining with belief and encouragement. Behind her, he could see others rising to their feet, adding their applause to hers. Samuel's hands returned to the keys, and he played the final phrase with such heartbreaking beauty that the silence that followed seemed sacred. Then the hall erupted. The standing ovation seemed to last forever. Samuel stood beside the piano, tears streaming down his face as wave after wave of applause washed over him. Critics who had come expecting a spectacle were on their feet, genuinely moved. Donors who had attended out of curiosity were reaching for their checkbooks. The live-stream comments were exploding with praise from viewers around the world. But Emily wasn't watching the celebration. She was watching Carla Prescott, who sat frozen at table 12, her face a mask of barely contained panic. While everyone else applauded, Carla was frantically typing on her phone, probably crafting damage control for her sabotage attempt that had so spectacularly backfired. Emily pulled out her own phone and opened the recording app. Over the past week, she'd gathered more evidence than just Carla's phone conversation. She'd documented everything: timestamps of when Carla accessed the music library, security footage she'd obtained from a sympathetic maintenance worker, and most damning of all, a recording she'd made that morning when she returned to the concert hall early. She'd found Carla there at 6 a.m., supposedly checking the acoustics, but actually examining the piano with suspicious intensity. Emily had hidden behind the stage curtains and recorded everything, including Carla's muttered comment. "Perfect. He'll never know what hit him." As the applause began to die down and Samuel prepared to speak to the audience, Emily stood up from her seat. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the small side stage where the audio-visual equipment was located. The lighting technician, Mike, a friend from her work-study program, looked at her in confusion. "Emily? What are you doing?" "I need to use the sound system," she whispered urgently. "Trust me, please. This is important." Mike hesitated, then stepped aside. Emily connected her phone to the hall's sound system, her hands shaking as she navigated to the recording she'd made that morning. On stage, Samuel had begun to speak, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's perfect acoustics. 23 years ago, I disappeared from the music world because I thought my ambition had cost me everything I loved. Tonight, you've reminded me that music isn't about personal glory, it's about connection, about sharing something beautiful with others." The audience listened with rapt attention, many wiping away tears of their own. "But before I continue," Samuel said, "I want to acknowledge that this performance almost didn't happen. Not because of stage fright or old trauma, but because someone tried to ensure I would fail tonight." A murmur rippled through the crowd. At table 12, Carla's face went white. Samuel's voice remained calm and dignified. "The piano was sabotaged. Someone loosened the tuning pins, knowing it would cause the instrument to slip out of tune during my performance. They wanted to humiliate me the same way they tried to humiliate me a week ago when this all began." The murmur grew louder. Guests turned to look at each other, confusion and anger mixing in their expressions. "Fortunately," Samuel continued with a slight smile, 23 years of practicing on old, imperfect instruments taught me how to adapt. Music finds a way, even when people try to silence it." That's when Emily pressed play on her phone. Carla's voice filled the grand hall with crystal clarity. "Perfect. He'll never know what hit him." The recording continued, capturing Carla's examination of the piano, her muttered complaints about Samuel's uppity attitude, and most damning of all, the sound of metal on metal as she worked on the tuning pins. The hall fell into stunned silence. Emily stood up beside the sound equipment, her voice shaking but determined. "I recorded this morning at 6 a.m. Ms. Prescott was in the concert hall, sabotaging the piano that Samuel would perform on tonight." All eyes turned to table 12, where Carla sat in horrified paralysis. The Morrison Foundation board members beside her were staring at her with expressions of disgust and disbelief. "I also have recordings of her phone calls to major donors," Emily continued, her confidence growing. "She's been conducting a whisper campaign, trying to convince you all that Samuel was mentally unstable and unreliable. She spread lies about substance abuse and questioned his musical abilities, all to protect her own reputation after she was caught on video mocking him. Dean Hayes took the microphone from Samuel, her voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. Carla Prescott, you are hereby terminated from your position, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. The audience watched in fascination as 2 security guards approached table 12. Carla finally found her voice, standing unsteadily and looking around the room with desperate eyes. This is ridiculous, she called out, her composure finally cracking completely. You're going to believe some janitor and a student over a development director who's raised millions for this institution? Yes, came a voice from the audience. Mrs. Morrison, the elderly matriarch of the Morrison Foundation, stood slowly, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades and unlimited wealth. We are. Because character matters more than fundraising ability, and tonight you've shown us exactly who you are. She turned to address the entire hall. The Morrison Foundation is immediately doubling our annual commitment to Brookshire Conservatory, with the specific stipulation that half of those funds go towards scholarships for talented students from underprivileged backgrounds. Students like the ones Mr. Washington represented tonight. Applause erupted again, but it was different this time, sharper, more purposeful. It was the sound of justice being served. As security escorted a red-faced Carla toward the exit, she turned back toward the stage with one last desperate attempt at defiance. This won't last, she shouted. When the novelty wears off, when the media attention dies down, you'll realize I was right. He's just a help. Samuel stepped back to the microphone, his voice gentle but firm. No, Ms. Prescott. I'm a teacher. And my first lesson is that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their job title. The audience's final standing ovation drowned out Carla's protests as she was removed from the building. Dean Hayes returned to the microphone, her voice filled with emotion and determination. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to announce the creation of the Samuel Williamson Scholarship Program, which will provide full tuition assistance to talented young musicians regardless of their economic background. And I'm even more pleased to announce that Mr. Washington has agreed to serve as our new artist-in-residence and director of this program. Samuel looked out at the audience, at Emily beaming in the front row, at the donors reaching for their phones to make additional pledges, at the cameras broadcasting this moment of triumph over cruelty to millions around the world. For the first time in 23 years, Samuel Williamson felt like he was home. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Practice Room A as Samuel listened to 10-year-old Marcus Johnson play Bach's Invention No. 1 in C major. The boy's small fingers moved across the keys with surprising confidence, though his technique still needed work. Better, Samuel said gently, sitting beside Marcus on the piano bench. But remember, Bach isn't just about hitting the right notes. Each voice needs to sing independently. Listen. Samuel played the same passage, his weathered hands demonstrating how 2 melodic lines could dance together while maintaining their distinct characters. Marcus watched in fascination, the same wide-eyed wonder that Samuel had seen in dozens of scholarship students over the past months. The Samuel Williamson Scholarship Program had exceeded everyone's expectations. What started as funding for a handful of underprivileged students had grown into a comprehensive program serving 43 young musicians from across the city. They came from public housing projects and trailer parks, from immigrant families and single-parent households, all united by raw talent and a hunger to learn. Now you try, Samuel said, moving aside to give Marcus room. As the boy began to play again, Samuel felt a familiar warmth in his chest. Each small improvement, each moment of musical discovery, felt like a piece of his own healing. Teaching these children wasn't just changing their lives, it was saving his. The practice room door opened quietly, and Emily Chin peered in, now wearing the badge of Assistant Program Coordinator. She'd deferred graduate school to help launch the scholarship program, finding her true calling in administration and student advocacy. Sorry to interrupt, she whispered. Marcus, your mom is here to pick you up. Already? Marcus looked disappointed. Can I practice more at home, Mr. Samuel? Of course, Samuel said, ruffling the boy's hair. But remember what we talked about, music should be joy, not pressure. Practice because you love it. After Marcus gathered his sheet music and ran to meet his mother, Emily settled into the chair beside the piano. How's he doing? He reminds me of myself at that age, Samuel said with a smile. All enthusiasm and big dreams. His family moved here from Detroit after his father lost his job. His mother works 2 jobs to keep them afloat, but she brings him here every Tuesday and Thursday without fail. Emily nodded, making a note in her tablet. Speaking of big dreams, I have news. The Juilliard School called. They want to discuss creating a pipeline program with us, direct admission pathways for our most promising scholarship students. Samuel's eyebrows rose. Juilliard? Apparently, word has gotten out about the quality of students we're producing. Maria Santos just got accepted to the New England Conservatory with a full scholarship. David Kim won the state youth piano competition. And yesterday, I got a call from Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall? Samuel's voice caught slightly. He still couldn't hear that name without thinking of the night that changed everything. They want to host a showcase concert featuring our scholarship students. Emily continued gently. With you as the featured performer, naturally. It would be filmed for PBS and broadcast nationally. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the piano keys. 3 months ago, the thought of returning to Carnegie Hall would have sent him into a panic. Now, he felt something different, not fear, but anticipation. When? He asked simply. 6 months from now. We'd have time to prepare the students, select the repertoire, make it something really special. The practice room door opened again, and this time a group of teenage students filed in for the advanced ensemble class. They came from every corner of the city's cultural spectrum: Amanda from Chinatown, whose parents ran a restaurant; James from the South Side, who'd learned piano on a keyboard his grandmother bought at a pawn shop; Isabella from East Boston, whose talent had been discovered by a music teacher who refused to give up on her students despite budget cuts. Mr. Samuel, Amanda called out excitedly. Did you hear? The video of our last recital got 2 million views on YouTube. And the comments are incredible. James added, pulling out his phone. Listen to this one. These kids are proof that talent doesn't care about your zip code. This program is changing the world, one student at a time. Samuel felt Emily's hand squeeze his shoulder as he looked around at these remarkable young people. They represented something he never dared to hope for during his years of hiding, a second chance not just to perform, but to matter. All right, everyone, Samuel said, moving to the piano. Let's warm up with some Chopin. Emily, would you like to join us? Emily smiled and moved to the second piano bench. Over the past months, she'd been taking lessons too, discovering her own musical voice under Samuel's patient guidance. As they began to play, teacher and coordinator, scholarship students from every background imaginable, the practice room filled with something more beautiful than perfect technique or flawless rhythm. It filled with hope. Outside in the hallway, Dean Hayes paused to listen, a smile playing at her lips. The conservatory's financial future was now secure, but more importantly, its soul had been restored. The viral video that had started everything was still being shared around the world, but now it represented something bigger than one man's remarkable return. It represented the power of second chances, the importance of seeing people for who they really are, and the truth that everyone deserves respect regardless of the work they do. Inside the practice room, Samuel played a gentle accompaniment, while his students took turns with solo passages, each one building confidence with every note. When Emily's turn came, she chose a simple melody that Samuel recognized, the theme from his improvisation on that magical night when everything changed. As their voices joined together in musical harmony, Samuel finally understood what his wife Maria had tried to tell him years ago. Music wasn't about personal glory or critical acclaim. It was about connection, about lifting each other up, about proving that beauty could triumph over cruelty. The janitor who had once hidden in practice rooms after midnight was gone. In his place sat a teacher, a mentor, and a living reminder that it's never too late to come home to who you're meant to be.